Hello everybody and welcome to today's COPE webinar. So today's webinar is entitled Practical Steps for Managing Paper Mills, and some of you may have attended last year's webinar, which was on the same topic, and this year's webinar is a continuation of that topic just because it is such an important issue in publishing at the moment. And we hope that this webinar will give you some updates on progress that COPE has made in tackling the issue of paper mills, and also give you some practical tips on managing your own cases. Okay, so I am Jigishir Patel and I am moderating this session. I am a member of COPE Council and an independent research integrity specialist. And we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers today. We have Renee Hoke, Sarah Elaine Eaton, and Joris Van Rossum. And I will introduce them in a bit more detail when they come to do their presentations. So an overview of this webinar. I will provide some updates from COPE around its activities related to paper mills. And then we will have 4 short talks. Renee will speak about practical steps on managing paper mills. Sarah will talk about the link between paper mills and contract cheating. I will provide some practical tips on managing paper mills, and then Joris will end with an update on the activities of the Research Integrity Hub. And there will be time for questions at the end. We have an hour and a half scheduled for this webinar. We may end early if we run out of questions to answer. Before we begin though, let's just make sure we all know what we're talking about. We all use the term paper mills, but I wanted to include a definition in this presentation to make sure that we all understand what they are. So COPE has a definition for paper mills, and that definition is a systematic manipulation of the publication process by an individual or a group of individuals who use dishonest or fraudulent practices to prevent independent peer review, sell authorship, publish fabricated or plagiarized research. And the goal is to influence the publication record and or receive financial gain. So with that definition in mind, I'm going to present some updates on what COPE has been doing around paper mills in the last year. Now, we know that paper mills have been around for a long time and they have become an increasing problem. And in order to be able to manage them and handle them, we need to understand more about how they work. And so COPE and STM jointly commissioned some research during the last year and published a report on paper mills. And the report aims to give an overview of this topic to explain how paper mills work, why they work, and what we can collectively do about them. To acknowledge a variety of individuals and organisations were involved in contributing to this research, and it was carried out by Jane Marks of Maverick Publishing Specialists. Now, the report is published, so I won't delve into all the findings now in this webinar. You can read the report, but I will just show you the recommendations at the end of the report. So the top recommendation was that a major education exercise is needed to ensure that editors are aware of the problem of paper mills and to train editors and editorial staff to identify these papers as they are submitted. There needs to be a change in the incentives for researchers so they no longer feel the need to use the services of paper mills. Protocols need to be implemented to impede paper mills from succeeding in their goals. And there needs to be a review of the retraction process to take into account the unique features of paper mills, and especially reviewing the options for propagating the retraction process across preprint servers and article repositories. And there needs to be continued investment in tools and systems to pick up suspected paper mills. So as well as that research and that report, another the update to report is that there are new code guidelines on the systematic manipulation of the publication process. I touched on this last year, but these guidelines have now been completed and are published, and they're quite comprehensive. So this is quite a long document which covers how paper mills work. And then there are infographics which cover the types of patterns that you can see in submissions, in the actual content of manuscripts, and around peer review, which might indicate that you have a paper mill. And then there are flow charts that guide you through the process of managing the paper mill, as well as recommended actions depending on how confident you are about your findings and all the evidence that you have uncovered. But despite that being quite a comprehensive document, there is still more guidance that is needed because paper mills are such a complicated issue. So we acknowledge that there is more guidance needed, and there's more guidance on the way. The four main areas where editors and publishers need further guidance from COPE are how to deal with the practical and administrative burden of collecting the evidence, how to provide timely due process that balances the series level and article level assessment, while also considering resources, impacts and constraints for journals and publishers. The scope and mechanism for cross-publisher information sharing needs to be explored. And we need to work out how to manage the conflicting demands of editorial freedom, publishers' responsibilities, and legal risk. So the new guidance will aim to encompass the following principles: the need for clear journal policies on the manipulation of the publication process, the need for confidential collaboration between publishers via COPE's Publishers Forum or the Stm Integrity Hub, a move towards the management and resolution of cases en masse rather than attempting to manage them on a case-by-case basis, more transparency in retraction notices related to the manipulation of the publication process, and empowering editorial decision-making so that it is based on all available facts and circumstances rather than the presence or absence of direct evidence, and empowering editors to make their own judgments on the type of information, be that raw data or other types of documentation that they want to ask for. And editors and publisher collaboration to make decisions based on trustworthiness of journal content. So that's the new guidance that is coming soon. Right, I'm going to pause there because it's now time for our first speaker. Our first speaker is Renee Hope. She is the managing editor for PLOS's publication ethics team, and she is going to provide a publisher's perspective on the practicalities of identifying and investigating paper mill concerns.
All right, so yes, thank you for joining us today. As Jigisha said, I'm going to share practical tips on managing paper mills from our perspective at PLOS, and I'll discuss also an example of a series that we recently investigated. To start with, I have a couple more polling questions to ask about your experiences with paper mill cases. You can answer the two questions put here. Paper mills aren't an issue that's restricted to any particular geographic area or any field of science or research. And there have been a number of different stories written about them over in the media and over various blog posts. So we have people who have experienced investigating paper mills across a number of domains, any of these areas of research: life sciences, biomedical, clinical, physical sciences, engineering and computer sciences, and the humanities. And a number of different types of issues have helped to identify the paper mill series in your experiences. Thank you very much. Excuse me. So we've seen a number of tactics used to manipulate the publication process, and these tactics are continuously evolving and include issues pertaining to article content, authorship, and peer review. An awareness of the tactics that are being used and how they're changing can help to inform our investigations of new cases. And publishers and journals can also use this knowledge to inform system-wide updates where we can identify potentially problematic content before it is published. How do we identify and investigate these series? Typically, a potential paper mill series comes to light because of a red flag or editorial concern that links multiple articles, typically involving different author groups. These red flags may be raised by external whistleblowers or might be identified based on internal audits or checks. Once a series of concern has been identified, our first step is to evaluate the scope of the concern by identifying effective content, searching through our submission databases and publications. We then do a deep assessment of an initial cohort of articles, which I'll discuss more on the next slide. And on the basis of that assessment, we evaluate the evidence and determine whether there is indeed evidence of series level concerns or potential paper mill activity. If yes, we'll use the information gained in our initial assessment to check for additional affected content. We'll also notify the affected journals and, where possible, implement pre-publication checks to identify similar content as it comes in. And then following this initial assessment step, which can be quite time intensive, we'll then proceed to follow up in accordance with COPE guidance. We notify the authors of the concerns and invite them to comment. Now, in some of these cases, we may be limited in the level of detail that we can share with the authors, as we need to respect the confidentiality of unpublished work and of the peer review process. When authors write back, we evaluate their responses and take action as needed based on the outcome of our assessment. We may also contact the relevant institutions at this stage. Now, typically, once an initial set of rejection or retraction decisions is issued, we'll still continue to receive submissions within a series for a short time. And so after the initial round of actions, we will circle back and continue to conduct periodic audits to identify related submissions until we are no longer receiving them. In evaluating a series for potential paper mill concerns, it's helpful to take a systematic and consistent approach in evaluating all of the affected articles. This can help to ensure consistency in decision-making and a fair and equitable treatment of all of the articles involved. This can also help to streamline the editorial assessment and ensure that it is as efficient as possible, bearing in mind that these cases can involve hundreds of articles. For the initial cohort, we typically do a thorough evaluation across the content, authorship, and peer review domains. And then based on trends identified in the initial cohort, we can then narrow the scope of checks for the larger series. So what do we look for? On the content side, we look for any evidence of recycled or plagiarized content. We look for any data or image integrity concerns, similarities in article structure and presentation, and we look into the details of the metadata provided with the submission and the files themselves. On the authorship side, we look in detail at the author information. We look for any authorship changes and trends in that area. We look in detail at the contributions and affiliations. And in some cases, we'll do a deep dive into the author's publication history. And then when we turn to peer review, we're looking for evidence of competing interests, any concerns in the reviewer information, in the reviews themselves with regards to the timing, content, or quality of the reviews. And we'll also look for patterns of linked activity between contributors. In other words, are there authors, academic editors, and/or reviewers that appear repeatedly together across the series? It's important to keep in mind that common concerns across a series of articles may indicate different underlying issues and warrant different actions than the same concerns noted for an isolated article. And it's also important to bear in mind that there's not always a smoking gun in these cases that provides definitive evidence of paper mill activity. The editor needs to consider the cumulative evidence, including the circumstantial evidence, and decide whether they trust and stand by the content and/or its assessment. In a recent case investigated by PLOS, the red flag that sparked the investigation had to do with author behavior. We noticed an author who was submitting a high frequency of articles within a relatively short period of time. And when we looked at their publication history, we noticed that they had published more than 100 articles in only about 18 months. And even for a very highly productive and collaborative researcher, this was an exceptional outlier in terms of productivity. When we looked into the submissions linked to this author, we found the same names appearing again and again. These names included only a small subset of the article's authors overall, and they also included a cohort of the journal's academic editors who had recently joined the board. This network of authors and editors have co-published numerous publications over the last 2 years. And importantly, this isn't a case where a single prolific research group submitted an exceptional volume of manuscripts, which in itself would be concerning. Instead, each submission within this series typically included a couple of these network authors, often including the corresponding author, as well as a group of authors from other institutions. Our deep assessment of this case revealed that there were recurrent authorship, competing interest, and peer review concerns across the series. We saw a number of authorship changes and concerns about contributions. We repeatedly saw that authors were requesting editors with whom they had potential competing interests, often involving that network that I mentioned on the previous slide. Reviewers often had potential competing interests that could impede an objective and unbiased review process. And we also noticed other peer review integrity concerns that I won't go into today to detail here. Now, we can't draw definitive conclusions as to the underlying cause of these issues. But whatever the root cause, based on our assessment, we concluded that for most articles linked to this network, retraction was warranted on the basis that the articles had been published based on a compromised or manipulated peer review process, and the authors had failed to disclose a major competing interest. In this case, the competing interests involved their collaboration history with the academic editors. When we retract articles on the basis of series-level concerns, as in potential paper mill cases, we use common language within the notices so that readers can link articles within the series based on the notice contents. We also specify within the notices that the issues involved concerns across a series of articles. But the case doesn't end with the retractions. In most paper mill cases, it's not just a single journal or publisher that's targeted. And the same issues faced by one journal may be faced by a number of other publishers. Also, once we've retracted an article, the authors may well take the same content and attempt to republish it elsewhere. And so it's essential to have good communication and collaboration across publishers so that we as an industry can effectively combat these issues. With that, I'll stop. Thank you very much and turn back over to Jigisha.
Thank you, Renee, for a really useful presentation. We're going to move on to the next speaker. We know it's important that preventing paper mills, when preventing paper mills, it's important that we understand the culture that motivates and perpetuates them. And our next speaker is Sarah Elaine Eaton, who is the Cope Council member and editor-in-chief of the International Journal for Education Integrity. And she is going to be presenting on the link between paper mills and contract cheating, systemic enablers and recommendations. So I will hand over to you, Elaine, to share your screen and your presentation.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction. As is customary, let's just start with a couple of polls here. I've launched them. There's 2 questions relating to paper mills and contract cheating. I invite you as the audience members to take a moment to fill out these 2 questions. Do you feel you have a solid understanding of contract cheating in the industry and how it operates? And do you feel you have a sense of the size and scope of the global contract cheating industry? Seeing those answers coming in, thank you so much for this. It's relevant to paper mills from a publishing and scientific perspective. And looking at the majority of answers that are coming in, looks like we've got folks saying no, that they don't feel that they have a solid understanding of contract cheating as an industry and how it operates, and no, not a great sense of the size and scope of the global contract cheating industry. So I hope today to provide you with some insights that are relevant to paper mills and also make the connection, connect the dots so that at the end you can have more informed conversations about the relationship between contract cheating and paper mills. So I'll end that poll now and just bring up my slides. So you can see the results of those polls on your screen. And we can see that folks here are experts in publishing, but less so in contract cheating. As Jigisha mentioned, I'm joining you from Calgary, Canada, where it's customary for us to begin with an acknowledgement of the land and territories. I'm joining you from the southern part of the province of Alberta, which is the home to the people of the Treaty 7 territory. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, which comprises the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. And that my home, the city of Calgary, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. In this short presentation today, I'll provide an overview of contract cheating, the links between contract cheating and paper mills, some historical insights into contract cheating, some questions that remain about paper mills, and recommendations and next steps. There's no universally accepted definition of contract cheating, but there are some characteristics that scholars agree on. And that's the outsourcing of primarily student academic work to a third party. But this is relevant because those students often then have careers in academia and science later on. We know that contract cheating occurs in just about every discipline, with very few exceptions, and it occurs in both text-based and non-text-based disciplines. So assignments can be outsourced, for example. Essays are a fairly traditional one that people know about, but also computer coding assignments, musical composition assignments, and other types of assignments. Those that are the least likely to be outsourced include performative assignments, demonstrations, for example. We know that contract cheating happens at the undergraduate and graduate levels. This definition provided by Draper and Newton in 2017 is particularly relevant to paper mills. They talk about a third party making a contribution to the work of the student, such that there is reasonable doubt as to whose work the assessment represents. If we extrapolate that for paper mills, we could think about paper mills as a third party that makes a contribution to the scientific or scholarly publication, such that there is reasonable doubt as to whose work the publication represents or the peer review represents. So you can start to see that there are some parallels here between student contract cheating and scientific and scholarly paper mills that are happening. And this is relevant because we know that paper mills don't exist in a vacuum, and they're part of a larger ecosystem of academic fraud and malpractice that includes contract cheating and other forms of third-party interference that threatens the integrity of science and scholarship and higher education. And some of what we know about contract cheating can be transferred to paper mills, but there's still a lot we don't know about paper mills. There's been, I think more than 15 years of scholarship now about contract cheating, as scholars around the world have delved into this and tried to understand how it works and its impact on higher education. And the term contract cheating was coined by Bob Clark and Thomas Lancaster in 2006 in the UK. They were two computer scientists who found their students outsourcing their coding assignments to an outfit called Rent-A-Coder. And before that, terms such as essay mills or term paper mills had been more prevalent. But Clark and Lancaster contended that a phrase was needed, a terminology was needed that encompassed both text-based and non-text-based disciplines. As a result, contract cheating has become globally accepted as a phrase that applies to all forms of outsourced academic work. And it can include assignment completion services, exam impersonation, student proxy services, thesis writing services, etc. And what's particularly relevant for this group is that the market for the outsourcing of graduate work, for example, PhD theses being outsourced, is becoming more prevalent. So this is relevant to paper mills because in a contract cheating field, what we're finding is that if graduate students can rationalize contract cheating as acceptable and the behavior becomes normalized, this may have implications for their future professional conduct in research and scholarship. So we can start to see that the habits around what might motivate someone to engage in with paper mills might start much earlier different than when they have a scientific or academic appointment. It might actually start in graduate school, and these links are important for us to understand. So in terms of the contract cheating industry, we know that this is a very sophisticated global industry that operates mostly today online. We've estimated the industry to be about 15 billion US dollars. And we also know that there are parent companies that operate other minor companies, sometimes in different languages, and that these are large global conglomerates, in addition to, say, the mom and pop shops that used to exist a long time. Some of the independent providers or suppliers still exist, but there's a fair amount of evidence to show that there are what we've sort of termed cheating cartels, parent companies that own a number of different product and service lines. This is now sort of well known within the community of academic integrity scholars. And a meta-analysis of the literature showed a conservative estimate about 3.5% of students worldwide would engage in contract cheating. So this meta-analysis was conducted prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. That was Guy Curtis and Joe Clare out of Australia. And then Guy Curtis with a team of researchers in Australia did a different and updated study with what they argued was a more sophisticated methodology. And they found that there were newer estimates that said about 4 times that would be the estimated prevalence of contract cheating among students, so about 12%. Their second study was limited to Australia, whereas the first one was a global meta-analysis. But nevertheless, it's not necessarily only the number of people engaged in this behavior, but the impact when only a small number of people engage in it. And furthermore, Curtis and Clare found that about 2/3 of students who engaged in contract cheating once were likely to repeat the behavior. So in other words, contract cheating can become a pattern of behavior. There isn't yet sufficient evidence to show if this can also apply to paper mills, but I think that there is an argument to be made for transferring what we know from 15 years of research about contract cheating to what we are learning about paper mills. And we're starting to learn that there is more parallels between these two industries. We also know that the provision and or advertising of contract cheating services is now illegal in the UK, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, and 17 US states. I am sorry to say that in my home country of Canada, it is not illegal for contract cheating services to operate. However, this movement towards legislation is gaining worldwide momentum. So a group of contract cheating scholars got together, and we've been working on an edited volume on contract cheating. It should be out in November. It's not out yet. But the chapters include insights into contract cheating graduate education. So I mentioned Cecilia Parther's work from New York in looking into graduate education and contract cheating. It could well be that if contract cheating happens among graduate students, that's a precursor or predictor of potential scientific or scholarly misconduct after graduation that could carry on. So this is relevant to paper mills. And we also have some historical and current understanding of the field that might help to inform what we know about paper mills. With regards to historical perspectives on contract cheating, we know that this phenomenon isn't new. And we found enterprises employing teams of staff dating back to 1939. That's not a typo, 1939. We have almost 100 years of evidence pointing to the commercial contract cheating industry operating. So we know that the industry isn't new. It didn't start with COVID. It didn't start with the internet. We do know that the internet has catalyzed the industry and provided opportunities for online marketplaces that didn't exist previous to that. And qualitative analysis of individuals who've worked for the industry show that suppliers exist all over the world. And there may be pockets where the industry is particularly prolific, but there's no country in the world where contract cheating doesn't happen. And there's no country in the world that necessarily doesn't supply individuals to work in the industry. And we also found a key finding for us in our qualitative analysis. This was in one chapter of the forthcoming book, that there was a through line in the accounts of individuals who had claimed that they had worked for the industry, again, dating back to 1939, that the higher education system itself creates conditions in which contract cheating flourishes. Again, this is relevant for paper mills because it begs the question, what are the conditions created by the higher education system and scientific community that allow paper mills to flourish? That question remains yet unanswered, but is certainly worthy of our consideration. We also know for contract cheating that the higher education system creates conditions that allow the contract cheating industry to flourish with, in particular, legal and policy loopholes that create opportunities for suppliers. So check out these quotations dating back to what we found was the earliest account of contract cheating, that in which the supplier claimed that most curricula overload the student, and that was a justification for students to outsource their material or their assignments to third parties, and that many students hardly know what a good essay looks like. Professors, as a rule, fail to discuss them and do not let students read the essays submitted by other members of the class. And this contract cheating supplier said, my papers stand as models and examples for the student. So there are things that potentially could be transferred or used as points of departure for discussion relating to paper mills about do researchers know what a good research paper looks like? And are senior members of the scientific and scholarly community mentoring early career researchers and graduate students in appropriate ways to help them understand what good scholarship looks like for publication? Mind you, there's still an awful lot that we don't know. We don't know about the valuation of the paper mill industry. We know that it is global and growing. And if what we know about contract cheating is any indication, it is reasonable to conclude that the paper mill industry could potentially be massive and worth hundreds of millions of dollars, American dollars, or Canadian or Australian dollars or more. We don't really have a clear sense of how many scholars engage with paper mills, but the point isn't one of scale, it's one of impact. And even a small percentage of scholars engaging with paper mills can create devastating impact to science, and it can be massive for the publication industry and scientific and scholarly community. And we must consider the ways in which the evaluation of researchers might contribute to the proliferation of paper mills. Again, these are larger questions that we don't yet have all of the answers to, but we can make some recommendations. So we've had some recommendations earlier. These ones complement those previously talked about. So collaborative research, I'm talking here about scholarship among those who research academic integrity and contract cheating, academic malpractice, and scholars of publication. So we don't yet have great links in our academic integrity scholarship community with those who research publication scholarship. So there's a lot of opportunities there for collaboration. And the linking between contract cheating and graduate education and paper mills, this requires our attention because the rates of repeat offenses and the normalization of malpractice can have a continued impact in the field. And I think that there's potentially a role for quality assurance bodies to play in paying attention to the quality of publications produced at research-intensive universities. So in other words, if research-intensive universities are to maintain their accreditation, then I think that there is some questions to be asked from the QA bodies about how those organizations maintain their quality of publications that are coming out of the institutions. There may also be a role for legislative bodies to play, particularly in jurisdictions where contract cheating or its advertisement is already illegal. Again, we need a lot more dialogue about this, but these are some things to think about for future actions. And in what way can legislation against contract cheating be levied against paper mills? These are questions we don't have answers to. However, we do know that organizations such as COPE can play a very important role in education and advocacy, and that the work can be supported and promoted by COPE members and others. There's some references for today's presentation and my contact information. And with that, I'll stop sharing and hand it back to Jigisha.
Thank you for that. So that was a broad view of how an issue it may well be an overspill from the culture within education. We're going to zoom right in from the broad view into the nitty-gritty of the practicalities of managing paper mills. So I'm going to put on my presenter's hat now and share my screen to share some slides with you on that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some practical tips on managing paper mills, and this will also revisit some of the slides that I presented at the webinar last year. So last year I presented a few slides that covered who runs paper mills, how paper mills work, and how are paper mills detected. And I won't read through all of this again, but just to point out that probably in the last column there, how are paper mills detected, during the last year, there's been increasing interest in new tools to do this and the use of technology, and we'll hear more about that later. I also showed this slide on how to investigate a suspicion at the journal level when looking at the content of a manuscript. And I highlighted what to look at within a manuscript. However, it's really important to remember that a single manuscript might not show enough evidence to indicate a paper mill. It may look by itself to be perfectly fine. It's the similar features that occur across a number of manuscripts that is important to look out for. And important questions that have come up when managing or trying to manage large-scale paper mills are: should you ask for raw data when you're investigating a paper mill? Should you involve an institution? And can you publish an expression of concern or a retraction? And if so, which? Well, regarding raw data, it's really important to think about what you need that raw data to do for you. How will it help you decide what to do? Because if you just ask for raw data, you will be sent massive Excel files full of numbers, which may actually slow down your investigation rather than help you come to a decision. So before you ask for data, decide what is the minimum information you need to verify the data. Or is there some other way that you can verify that the data was collected? If you do decide that you need the raw data, then before you ask for it, decide who will have the expertise to judge that once you receive the files. Will you be able to do it yourself? Will you need to get in expert reviewers? And then regarding institutions, similarly, think carefully about how an institution is going to help with your investigation. Remember, they can't help you investigate manipulation of your own systems, but they can help you with specific questions like, did the authors do the research at that institution? They can confirm the existence of data, and they can investigate concerns about research ethics in humans and in human studies and animal studies. Or if you feel that a group of researchers at a particular institution are behind a paper mill, then consider informing the institution that this is occurring within their organization. And finally, do remember that there are code retraction guidelines that can help you make a decision on whether to retract or publish an expression of concern. And for example, peer review manipulation is in the code guidelines as a reason to retract. And that may be enough for you to take some action without needing to ask for raw data or involve an institution. With expression of concerns, it's very much down to editorial judgment on how far you feel that the reported research has been undermined. And we hope to have some guidance on that too in the future. So that was all a quick recap from last year on what to do when you find yourself in the middle of investigating a paper mill. But how do you go about avoiding publishing paper mills in the first place? Well, it's important to remember that paper mills test your systems and processes, and they look for areas that are weak or where no one is watching. And so you need to know the vulnerabilities of your own processes. So what do I mean by that? What do I mean by checking for vulnerabilities or knowing vulnerabilities? Well, here's a very simple workflow for the manuscript processing. And if you look at this, there are vulnerabilities all the way along the process where it is possible that nobody is looking at what's happening to the content of a manuscript or the authorship or the institutions within the manuscript. So you need to ask yourself, when you get a submission, are you checking for features of paper mills like potential plagiarism or image or data fabrication? And importantly, are you looking for patterns of unusual behavior across your submissions and other journals? Because it's not just what's in the individual manuscript that matters, it's whether what's in one manuscript is similar to what's in another manuscript, where the same names turn up, where the same institution names turn up, whether the content looks similar. Ask yourself whether your peer review system is secure. Do you verify the identity of your peer reviewers? Is it possible that they can be impersonated by somebody else? And can the content of the manuscript, including authorship and institutions, be easily changed during revision and or after editorial acceptance without anybody noticing? So you can imagine that during these processes, if it's a very busy journal or busy editors, it may be that nobody actually reads the manuscripts or checks the manuscripts at these points. And those are the weaknesses where a whole entire manuscript may be swapped out, the content may be swapped out, or the authorship may be swapped out for something else. And it's also important to remember that this area here, where the journal editor is looking after peer review, editorial decision making, and what to accept, this can be a huge vulnerability if it's handed over to a guest editor. And you need to ask yourself, if you do this, do you check their identity and expertise? And do you tell them your expected standards? Do you monitor what they do? And this is particularly relevant to cases where special issues have been taken over by a paper mill. And importantly, does everybody involved in the processing of manuscripts understand what paper mills are and what to look out for and how to flag their suspicions? Because remember, paper mills can be manipulated, it can manipulate systems outside the editorial system in the production phase here. So make sure everybody who's involved knows what to look for. So to summarize, how to avoid publishing paper mill manuscripts: be aware of how manipulation of the publication process works, and know what to look for in individual manuscripts, publication workflows, and databases. And I refer you to the new COPE guidance document on this, where there are details in the infographics on what to look for. And raise awareness across departments, it's not just an editorial issue. And remember, when you're screening on submission, don't just screen on submission, keep an eye on what's happening to manuscripts throughout the manuscript workflow, including after editorial acceptance. And it's not just the content of individual manuscripts, it's the content of individual manuscripts in relation to the content of other manuscripts that might be submitted to the same journal or other journals that you need to look at as well. And monitor what you publish, and this may be by way of formal audits of your journal content or informal audits. And make sure your peer review process is secure. Make sure your guest editors are aware of expected standards for editorial decision making and peer review, and check their compliance with these standards. And finally, remember, there is COPE guidance on paper mills to gather information and help with decision making. Think carefully about requesting raw data, and think carefully about involving institutions. And use COPE retraction guidelines to help you make decisions on retractions versus expressions of concern. And look out for more COPE guidance that is on the way. And just to finally give you, there's a list of some useful COPE documents and guidance for managing paper mills. So the next speaker is Joris Van Rossum. He is Director of Research Integrity at STM, and he is going to give us some updates on the activities of the STM Research Integrity Hub in relation to technical solutions for managing paper mills. I'll hand over to you, Joris.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. I also would like to start with a poll. And the question here is, how important will technology play in combating paper mills, and especially thinking about screening manuscripts? So will it be less important than human screening? Will it be more important, or will it be equally important? I'm very curious what your thoughts are. I would say more people think it's more important, but equally important is the majority. And I think that is very much in line with our vision. In the end, technology can help us with flagging specific papers or content, but it will in the end always be the human being that will make the decisions. So thank you for this. Let me share my screen and go to my presentation. So I'm going to talk to you about the STM Integrity Hub, where we are with this project. I'm with STM. In case you don't know, STM is the Global Association of Scientific, Technical, and Medical Publishers. When you think about research integrity and paper mills specifically, collaboration is really key. And not only collaboration between publishers, for example, think about duplicate submissions across multiple publishers and journals that clearly need a joint solution to solve that, but also, of course, collaboration with multiple stakeholders in the ecosystem. We work very closely with COPE, for example, in the context of the white paper that was discussed, but also thinking about incentives, thinking about research assessment. We have to collaborate with the wider ecosystem, with funders, with governments, with institutions, etc., which we do with STM. What we also know is that technology is increasingly important in research integrity and paper mills specifically. A lot of the papers that are produced by paper mills are created very sophisticatedly by means of creating language, manipulating images, or even data. And we have to basically counter that and also use technology in order to identify these problematic papers. We also need to build a larger training corpuses. AI plays a bigger role in identifying manipulated papers. There was discussions about image manipulation and data manipulation. For AI to be trained on that, we need large training corpuses, again, highlighting the need for collaboration in the ecosystem. Collaboration also allows us to share tools that were developed by publishers. So if publisher A developed a tool, collaboration will allow others to benefit that as well. And also creating interoperability standards for systems and tools will also greatly facilitate the sharing of tools, helping us to ensure that paper mill material and other compromised material does not enter the scholarly record. And last but not least, we have to make sure that there is a lower barrier for the smaller mid-sized publishers to join and contribute. Of course, larger publishers are often able to build systems to have large editorial integrity teams. And we have to make sure that the smaller publishers also have equal access to the same tools and resources to ensure, again, that we can screen and prevent paper mill material from entering the scholarly record. For this reason, the STM Association launched the Integrity Hub. We announced this in December of last year, and I'm going to talk you quickly about the progress. The mission of the Integrity Hub is to equip the scholarly communication community with data, intelligence, and technology to protect research integrity. So it's really on those three levels that we want to address this challenge. First of all, by knowledge exchange. What we do today is, of course, also knowledge exchange, but among publishers, we are really in depth sharing these various signals that are indicative of paper mills. So what kind of language is used, what kind of and things that were discussed today, irregularities in terms of the reviewer process, authorship, data, images, etc. So sharing that information among publishers already helps the publishing community greatly. We also work on the level of policies and frameworks. So thinking about legal frameworks, but also developing editorial policy development together with COPE. For example, when building a tool that can detect simultaneous submissions across publishers, we have to make sure we have the right editorial policies to support the work of publishers and editors. And last but not least, we are building an enabling infrastructure, allowing content to be shared in a responsible way, in a safe way, and allowing third-party and tools to access the content submitted to publishers, so that, again, we have an ecosystem whereby incoming manuscripts through submission systems can be structurally screened with tools that were selected by the publishers. We started in December, and we already have 23 partners collaborating in the Collaboration Hub. As you can see, publishers from all sizes and all subject areas and submission systems collaborating with us as well. So what do? I'm going to talk to you through the works of the various working groups. So our work is organized in working groups that are tackling a specific challenge that we are faced with. And a very important one, of course, is paper mills. And with this working group, again, as I mentioned, we share experiences and we share signals. But we're also building what we call paper mill checker tool, which is a tool allowing publishers and editors to upload submitted manuscripts and checking these for various signals. We aim for a soft launch in October of 2022, and we already incorporated 3 signals that are indicative of paper mills. One of them is developed by ourselves, and also 2 external signals that will develop by experts. And the idea is basically in this paper mill checker tool to incorporate the various signals that are now available, allowing again for a very optimal screening for paper mills. Again, to stress, the tools we build, the screening tools, will never determine whether something is coming from a paper mill. That's always a human being, the editorial decision that has to be made, but the technology will support them, again, equip the editorial teams to make informed decisions about incoming manuscripts. Again, in this paper mill tool, we are working with external research integrity specialists, but also integrating the various signals that were collected by the publishers collectively. The second working groups is working towards a duplicate submission tool. Duplicate submissions are a problem in itself, but also indicative of paper mills. What you often see is that paper mills submit the same manuscript or slightly changed manuscripts to multiple journals and publishers at the same time. And of course, talking about collaboration, for this to detect, you need a system that can screen incoming manuscripts across different journals and publishers. And that is exactly what we are building here. And we aim to have this live in an MVP in Q1 of 2023. And at the moment, we are incorporating the submission flow, the incoming manuscript flow from 2 submission systems into the collaboration hub. And again, so when it's live, publishers will be able to switch this on, whereby information from the submission systems flows into the collaboration hub, whereby screening tools can detect duplicate submissions, again, respecting and maintaining the confidentiality and all the legal conditions that go with submission and publication. The third elements, the third working group is looking at image alteration and duplication. As we also seen today, a lot of manipulation takes place on the level of images, duplication of images, changes, etc., which requires really technology tools to screen that. And what we've done so far with that working group is collect a list of requirements and features that screening tools should adhere to. And there are various tools already developing these kind of tools, and we want to make sure that the needs of publishers are met with the development of these tools. So we publish these on the STM website. We also ask these screening tools, these providers, to self-assess themselves against these requirements. So we will publish in the near future a list of available tools for publishers and editors, again, alongside these list of features that the publishing community considers crucial and important for these tools to have. Further plans for this is still to be decided, but again, collaboration allows for a lot of options here. We can think about creating training sets for these tools. We can do evaluation of these tools, but we also plan to incorporate these screening tools into the Integrity Hub, making it easier for publishers to connect to these systems. So this is very shortly. So long story short, we have been working not often for a year, but we're already starting to launch our soft launches, and we are aiming for an MVP in Q1 of 2023. Very important, it's work in progress. It is the collective work of a lot of publishers and other organizations. Collaboration is key. So if you're interested, please contact me to join this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Joris. I think we are, and we're ready for questions. Now, there have been lots of questions flying around in the Q&A box, and I think some of them have already been answered. So if you just bear with me, we're just going to pick out some questions which would be useful to answer in this session. And we will try and answer all the questions if we don't get to them in this session after the webinar. So I think here we have a question for Sarah, Sarah, regarding preprint services, we have found that often the format of a preprint indicates it was prepared for a different journal than the one to which it has been submitted. What's the difference between, so that's the first question, and it's asking for a comment. Do you have any comments on submissions to preprints and how that might relate to paper mills and contract cheating even?
One thing I like about these questions is that they point to the many complexities of these fields and the different nuances here. And so, it's impossible to say if a preprint shows the formatting for one journal, but then it's subsequently published later, if that's a clear indication of paper mill activity. It could be an indication of duplicate submission, or that the manuscript was withdrawn or rejected, of course. So I think it's impossible to say on sort of that as a singular data point, but it can certainly raise questions. But I'll defer to my fellow presenters to see if anyone else has other things they'd like to offer on that.
Yeah, I would just echo what you said, Sarah, which is that that may be a reflection of the manuscript's history before publication as much as anything else. And so wouldn't make big assumptions based on that one point, just as Sarah said.
Thank you. A question for me about the overlap between paper mills and predatory publishers. Are these considered separate but equally concerning issues in the peer review and publishing process? And I would say yes, they're both equally concerning. They're slightly different in how they operate. Predatory publishers are organizations or set up to look like legitimate publishers, but do not have good quality control mechanisms. And so the publications are not properly peer reviewed. They're just published for a fee. Whereas paper mills are slightly different in how they operate, where they obtain a fee from authors for publication and can target legitimate journals in trying to achieve this. And there may be an overlap between the two in that a predatory publisher may operate a paper mill or be part of a paper mill. So again, speaks to the complexity of the situation. And more research, I think, is needed to understand how these two work together and separately. Okay, do we have any more? I'm just checking for more questions. Another question for Sarah here. Is there evidence on how many contract cheaters go on to get a PhD and become scientists?
Yeah, that was an excellent question. As far as I know, there's currently no available evidence on that, and it's a perplexing question for sure, and I'm not sure one that we can answer definitively. However, I can say that I know of cases where, for example, degrees have been rescinded after academic misconduct has been found after graduation. In some institutions, and I don't know about the policies for all universities, but some universities don't have what we would call a statute of limitations for academic misconduct post-graduation. So if there's an academic fraud that's discovered post-graduation, that degrees could be rescinded. I don't think it happens very often. It requires a lot of investigation, and those are the kinds of cases that might end up going to court in the respective countries. But the fact that the policy provisions are there to tackle that if the misconduct is found subsequently, I think points to the interest of universities in maintaining the integrity of their degrees. But to answer the question directly, I don't know of any such data.
We have a general question here. Does anybody have any advice on how to handle a situation where a journal is persistently being targeted by a paper mill, despite them being the paper mill submissions being identified and rejected promptly? Is there something that needs to be put in? Sorry, is it just something that needs to be put up with until the paper mill decides to move onto an alternate target? So I guess, is that a question for you, Renee? And that how would you, in your experience, prevent being targeted again?
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't control what other people will do. as much as sometimes we might like to. However, I think, if you are being repeatedly targeted, having clear policies or taking a hard line when these issues come up, I think might be one of the best things that you can do, so that you're perceived to be a publisher that will not allow the manuscripts through to publication. And hopefully people will get the message after you've seen a few of these cases. But it is unfortunate that I think there may be journals or publishers that are targeted repeatedly by these cases.
Thank you. A question along similar lines. Although these additional checks for paper mills are extremely important, this does not seem sustainable at the editorial office level, for example, for managing editors, editorial assistants, etc. What recommendations do you have for incorporating this additional work when journals are often already at capacity and understaffed? So, I would say I totally agree that it is quite an overwhelming problem. Everybody is so busy and everybody is so overwhelmed, and that is what is being exploited. In many cases, paper mills get away because nobody, notices, because everybody is so busy. So this is a challenge for the entire industry. Everybody has got this problem. I would say that, again, looking for vulnerabilities is probably one of the things that can be done within the system. So even if it's a slight change of process, or even if it's a slight change of policy, which sends out signals to the paper mills that actually this journal is, clued up and is checking, might be enough to deter a paper mill from trying to target that journal. Don't know whether anybody else has anything to add to that.
Yeah, maybe I have something to add. I think indeed there are many signals, and to check all those signals is very challenging. So what we aim to do with the Integrity Hub is also bringing all those signals together and using the collective intelligence of those signals to indicate whether there's a problem. So almost like a spam filter, that incoming manuscripts are checked by one tool, but they use multiple signals, again, giving a flag to an editor, check this, or this looks safe. So again, the challenge is to make this complex availability of signals into a clear workflow, making it easier for editorial teams to check manuscripts.
And just adding a couple other points. One is, I think, hopefully new tools will help to make some of these checks more easy to do at scale for publishers to help with this issue. But ultimately, as we see these issues grow and evolve, it really speaks to the importance of resourcing the integrity work that journals need to do in order to protect the integrity of what they publish.
Question on tools here. So on screening and peer review stages, the question says, can I ask about data fabrication? I think the better phrase is irregularities. What methods do you recommend for this process? How reliable are they? E.g. false positive risk. Does code point people to any such tool? So I think this is about a tool about data fabrication and screening during peer review. Joris, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think so. If you look at if you think at the three levels, right? So you have language, and we have quite good tools to detect plagiarism. And then we have images. There are tools being developed to detect irregular behavior in images, duplication, manipulation, etc. And data is maybe the most challenging now to automate, to check. So indeed, in the peer review process, it's very important, of course, to have data. That's also what we stimulate at STM, to make sure that the data is linked to from the articles, so that also the peer reviewers can check it. To do that in an automated way is really the challenge, I think, for technology. So I don't think there are tools yet, but it's definitely also on our agenda to make sure that data can be checked for these issues as well. So I would say, unfortunately, no tools available yet, but we're working hard, very hard on developing these.
Thank you. So the next question is, as editors, how do we proceed with submissions that we suspect are paper mill but have no definite proof?
I think there's not a very clear and definitive answer here, and a lot of these cases will come down to a judgment call on the level of evidence that you have and whether you trust the work enough to allow it through to peer review. But I think if you're uncertain, you can put in some additional checks for that submission, looking more carefully at the data, looking more carefully at some of the information and documents the authors provide. But ultimately, it will come down to a judgment call. And Jigisha, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I echo what you say. And I think you need, as an editor, you need to stand by the integrity of what you publish. And if you don't feel confident about a submission, then, that in itself, if you have concerns, that you have doubts about its integrity, that in itself is evidence enough to not let that submission proceed.
I can chime in with some policy background for academic misconduct. And I can say there's been a movement away in universities and colleges globally from having 100% proof or an airtight case. It doesn't need to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt, as we might say in Canada and the United States. But instead, we've moved to what we call a balance of probabilities model, which means that on the balance of probabilities, considering all evidence, whether it's direct or circumstantial, how likely is it that this behavior has happened? And that really changes the conversation, because then we don't need sort of an airtight case. We need enough to show that on the balance of probabilities, this is what's happened. And I think what we're sort of talking around here is that same idea that we may not be able to get an airtight case, and it may not be worth our time. But looking for this from, is this probable? Yes, then we can move ahead with next steps.
Thanks, Sarah. I think that is, you've hit the nail right on the head there. What it is we're trying to encapsulate, even in our guidance, is to empower editors to make that judgment on the balance of the information that they have. Yeah. A question here. This is a question for raising critical points. Presumably when investigating a paper mill, how much of the evidence that a paper is a paper mill product should be shared with the authors of the manuscript or article? Renee?
So this is another case where there's a bit of a balance to strike. So you need to give the authors enough information for them to understand why you've made an editorial decision. For example, if you've decided to reject or retract an article, you want them to understand why. But at the same time, you wouldn't want to give the level of information that would enable them to bypass your checks and to make it more difficult to detect paper mill submissions in the future. And so typically what we would do is provide authors information about some of the article level flags that we identified in our assessment, but we'll also include information such as additional issues were also identified that apply across a series of articles. And so that they understand that we're giving them some of the information about specific concerns applying to their article that they can see for themselves, but we also have additional concerns. But again, it is a bit of a balance that we're working to strike on those communications.
Another question for everybody. I am curious about the potential legal exposure for publishers who find and reject articles with suspect research and communicate their findings to other journals in the field. This is a concern in the US for this communication. I acknowledge this is a broad topic, so there's no expectation of legal advice, but it's a question of dealing with legal challenges and legal threats.
The legal side of these cases can get quite complicated, but and ultimately we wouldn't want to put ourselves at risk for defamation claims or other such legal challenges. There is guidance from COPE on sharing information across publishers that speaks to sharing the objective details with others who are investigating similar cases for whom that information may support their investigation. And so sharing that factual information with other affected publishers is covered under that guidance. But generally speaking, I think if there are concerns, I think that it's worthwhile to speak to legal counsel for the journal or publisher and get their recommendations. There often are considerations around the privacy policies about what can and cannot be shared.
And just to add to that, I think it's very useful to have policies upfront about what about the process and what will happen if a paper mill is suspected, so that authors are given a prior warning as well, so that they're not taken by surprise when you follow your process. Okay, another question about paper mill checking tools. There is a chance the paper mills will be able to work out how the tool does its checks and will do all they can to circumvent it. It's been a problem for us to develop our checking systems, and they're not broadcast how we do it too widely. We're also careful about how we query authors so that they can get information from them without giving away our methods. So this speaks to the whole issue of how do we share information between each other and share information about how we investigate and detect paper mills without giving away too much information. I'll put this question to Joris about have you thought about how to address how you can prevent paper mills from circumventing the tools that are used to detect them?
On the one hand, it is we're in the arms race, and so there will be an evolution. So we will have an answer, and then the paper mills will come up with different tools. So we expect to be in an arms race for quite a while. And that's why also we have to collaborate in order to have that advantage on technology when we work together. But indeed, sharing information with suspected paper mill submissions is very important. So we also recommend don't give away too much. Don't say what you exactly found, because that will train them what to avoid. So be careful with that. And my last comment there, indeed. So as the publishing community, the participating publishers in the hub, we exchange information, but we do it in a very safe way. So we have regular meetings, but we have a document which can only be accessed by the participating publishers. And also we really make sure that information does not leak out, because of course that would be, so yeah, it's something we have to be constantly aware of.
And the next question is, we know that editorial oversight is a hard wall for paper mills to get over, but in recent years, publishers have launched many special issues, and there is evidence that some guest editors are working with paper mills. My question is, with guest editors, how should editors maintain a firewall against paper mills to prevent their product from being published in special issues? So I touched on this in my presentation about how having guest editors is a vulnerability. If you have a guest editor and you know nothing about them, you haven't given them any information about the standards you expect from them, you don't monitor what they do, the decisions they make, then that is a huge vulnerability. So you can have guest editors, you can have special issues, but they should all be subject to the same standards and monitoring as any, the regular journal editor, and be part of your sort of anti-vulnerability campaign when you're looking to paper mill proof your journal. Okay. Anybody else have comments on that? Well,
I can chime in, from the perspective of a journal editor and say guest editors and special issues, as you say, Jigisha, don't absolve the editor-in-chief of their editorial responsibilities, right? That the editor-in-chief still needs to provide oversight and is still ultimately responsible for the reputational quality of the journal. So I'll just add that to what you said.
I'll add one more comment, which is that it's not just guest editors where there's this vulnerability for journals that use external editorial boards. Typically, these are volunteer positions, and they do get vetted. For example, at FLOSS, we'll vet the editorial board applicants. But I think what we need to keep that vulnerability in mind when considering how we monitor and audit the behavior of editorial board members in addition to guest editors.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just checking for the next questions. So the next question is, what about review papers or manuscripts with a format that do not include any data? How would those be screened, or how would those be detected?
I don't mind chiming in here to get us started. This for me speaks to disciplinary differences in fields, right? So coming from social sciences and humanities, we might have conceptual papers, philosophical papers, position papers that wouldn't include any data that could still be a form of scholarship. So, from that perspective, there's absolutely a place for that. That it may be different in the clinical sciences, but things such as systematic and scoping reviews might have a place as well. So I think that this speaks to disciplinary data, and then being the editor-in-chief of a multidisciplinary journal, we have different types of manuscripts from different fields, some of which include first priority data or first person data or secondary data or conceptual papers. It really depends on the academic discipline.
In some cases, you can see similarities across manuscripts, even if in the absence of data, just looking at the structure, how the article is put together, how it's framed, and the language that's used. And then looking at also at some of the people information, et cetera, you can get some other clues there. So you're not limited to just looking at the data. And the example that I talked about today with regards to the peer review process, I didn't even talk about the data, as you might notice. And so you can look at the review process as well.
This is related to the next question, which is, can you give some more insight into the contribution of the peer review process to paper mills? How do they work? Any particular example? So would you like to, Renee, would you just like to reiterate your case, or I can describe what can happen with guest editors?
Sure. So one mechanism that can be used is that a service can be offered to help a manuscript through peer review. An editor can be inserted into the journal who then accepts to handle the peer review of the submissions, and then they invite reviewers who may or may not be real reviewers, and who provide favorable outcomes for the process overall. And so I think that when thinking about the paper mill process and how it inserts itself into the peer review, you can think about who is involved in the peer review process, and when the paper mill contributors are themselves serving in the roles as editors or as reviewers, then this will impact what comes through to publication.
Yes, and I would just add to that as well that one of the very first paper mills that was detected at Biomed Central, the peer review was manipulated not by inserting a guest editor, but actually by manipulating the submission process, which allowed authors to input the emails of their suggested reviewers. And what they did was they fabricated the emails. So when those suggested reviewers were invited, the invitation went straight to the authors, who then fabricated the peer review report. So that's just another way that peer review can be manipulated. Okay, so we're fast approaching the half hour here. So one last question before we wrap up. Do you have thoughts on the role of technology in detecting unusual activity en masse that sometimes detects genuine research done by those who have previously been involved in fraudulent submissions? I'm thinking of researchers who don't always use third-party services, but have done in the past. So I guess this is about
do we forgive past misdemeanors and but who get detected, but people who get detected because they've done something in the past, but who are now submitting genuine research. I guess it would depend on the actual submissions and whether they show any features or that are suspicious or suspicious patterns of behaviour in relation to other submissions. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that question.
I can reflect back on what we know from contract cheating, right? That meta-analysis from Curtis and Claire that was conducted in 2017 when they found about 2/3 of people who engaged with contract cheating once were likely to become repeat offenders. So that left about 1/3 of people who may have engaged with contract cheating services once and then didn't go on to repeat that in subsequent behavior. So there could be cases where an individual has, gone down the road of working with paper one time and then not engaged in that behavior subsequently. So that's one piece of it. And then what are the repercussions or the consequences for that individual? That might be determined by, the journal editor within to that particular journal. It could have implications for the person at their university or their research institute where they work, and there could be consequences that are imposed by their employer. So I don't think that there's a clear-cut answer for this, but I think what you're pointing to is the possibility that if somebody's done it once, it doesn't guarantee that they will do it again, although there may be a probability.
Thank you. We have run out of time now, so we won't be able to address any more questions, and we have lots of questions. So we will try and answer some of them and put them up on the website along with the recording of this webinar. So I'm just going to share my last slides with you just to close this webinar. So the next steps following this webinar is we'd love to have your feedback. So please give us your feedback by responding to the email we will be sending you after this webinar. And as I've mentioned already, an edited recording of the webinar will be available on the COPE website. So I'd like to thank all the speakers for taking part today with their fantastic presentations and really interesting discussions. Goodbye, everybody.